Good morning.
Morning.
Just feel free to move around a little bit if you'd like to turn your seat to face this direction, or for people who are outside, if you want to be able to see, or the sun moves or the earth moves, which makes the sun seem like it moved in relation to people online. Maybe you want to wiggle. So it seems like summer has arrived, finally. Nice. The plums, we have yellow plum tree by my office in the backyard, and to me that's always the sign of the middle of summer, is that those yellow plums, they start to drop. And if we get them early enough, we can eat them. But by the time they drop, usually they're not very good. They squish on the ground and they're usually getting brown. So it's nice to have some fresh fruit. We've been having berries, but plums, and then other things will start coming on as the season unfolds. It's, to me, a reminder of the remarkable place that we live. If you haven't noticed how beautiful the Willamette Valley is lately, please drink of it deeply, especially in these times of difficulty. To feel the embrace of the earth, to feel the embrace of the world is, I would say, extra important right now. It's always important, but extra important right now. So easy to get very narrow, for the energy to come up into our head and into our heart in a certain afflictive way, and then to be just very anxious about everything. There's plenty of good reason to be anxious. I don't mean to say that. But that if we just live with that anxiousness, that creates so many problems for ourselves and for other people. So to feel that embrace of the world is one of the ways in which we can release that anxious energy. She's perfectly willing to receive it from us. Quite remarkably. So this morning, I'd like to start a second talk about wisdom. And the series of talks that I've been giving over the past few months have been titled Freedom Of. So freedom of the various facets of the six perfections. So we talked first about freedom of forbearance, and we talked about the freedom of vigor. We talked about freedom of meditation, and now we're talking about the freedom of wisdom. When we talk about wisdom, it has to do with how it is that we conceive the world, how it is that we conceive phenomena. And I'm choosing the word conceive here really carefully. So oftentimes we might use the word perceive. So if I say it's how wisdom has to do with how we perceive the world. When we use the word perceive, there's a tendency to think that there's a world out there, there are phenomena out there, and that what I'm doing when I experience a phenomena is I'm just experiencing something that is out there. Right? I'm perceiving it. Right? The reason I'm using the word conceive here is because our act of encountering a phenomena, or the actuality of a phenomena arising through our experience of something being there, is not just a one-way street of me perceiving something that's out there. Right? There's a whole process of conception which happens for a phenomena to arise, to be birthed into our world. Right? We are participating. We are looking at it in a certain way. We bring a whole host of causes and conditions through our being. Right? And so when it encounters some stimulus that seems like it's outside of us, a phenomena arises. It arises together. Right? So one of the primary ways that we create suffering is we forget that fact. We think that the world is just how it is. It has nothing to do with how it is conceived. It just has to do with the way that it is independently. Now, within the Buddha Dharma, one whole facet of the Buddha's teachings has to do with how do we reorganize that part of our way of being in the world, that part of us that wants to make the world just be this thing that's out there. How do we reorganize that? That whole branch of Buddhist teaching practice is referred to as prajna, is referred to as wisdom teachings. These are teachings that are encouraging us and showing us how to liberate the way we conceive the world, the way that we see things, the way that the world arises through this dynamic interpenetration of self and other. So it holds this very central place within the Buddhist teachings. And you can see why. Because of the very core of how it is that we conceive of the world, right, is shifted. The way that we act in the world, the way we experience things, the way we think about things, those all change immensely if we can work with this very basis of conception. And so wisdom is thought of as being this great medicine, the great medicine of wisdom. It's such a great medicine because it goes right to the center of where it is that suffering arises from. Suffering arises from a Buddhist teaching standpoint. It arises from grasping. But we could also say that it arises from pushing away, which is just the same thing as grasping, right? But it just has a kind of opposite appearance. So greed and hate are what we talk about that. Grasping and pushing away are greed and hate. And we say that those are based in delusion. They're based in the idea that things are just how they are, right? And I need to pull the things I want close to me, and I need to keep the things away from me that I don't want to be close to me. And as I'm struggling to do that all the time, I'm anxious because I know that it can never stay in a perfect situation, right? There are always going to be things moving towards me that I don't want to, and things that I don't want to move away from me, moving away from me. So I'm always anxious of that. And that anxiousness is a deep sense of unharmonized quality of life. So this, I'm outlining this again because this is essential to the Buddhist teachings, and it's the very core of what the Buddhist teachings are trying to do, is to speak into that cycle of life and death, of grasping and pushing away, that gives rise to that kind of anxiousness, which we can experience if we just sit down. We take a minute, we go, whoa, what is that? Why can I not just sit here simply and quietly and be? What's so hard about that? And so we plant seeds. And in the case of wisdom, we talk about planting a boundless seed. Right? We plant a seed into that soil, the soil of our mind, the soil of the way it is that we conceive of things. Right? And we plant a seed that tells a different story. It doesn't tell the story of self and other. It tells the story of our marvelous wholeness. That your wholeness and my wholeness are not set against each other. You're not out there as a partial being and I'm in here as a partial being, but that we are completely whole beings, and we're sharing the wholeness of a remarkable world. So when we listen to prajna teachings or wisdom teachings, I ended my talk last week with this, they can sound really confusing. And they sound really confusing because they're talking in a way that is just opposite of the normal way that we think about things. Right? So when we hear the words of these Prajnaparamita teachings, sometimes it just sounds like nonsense to us in one way or another. Thich Nhat Hanh, one of the most eminent modern teachers of Zen, quoted this phrase called the dialectics of prajna, or the dialectics of wisdom. He refers to the way these teachings are presented as being a kind of a philosophical pattern. And so it can be really helpful to know what that is like as you encounter the teachings. It is the seed that I'm talking about, that boundless seed, which unlocks this very center of how the machine of suffering keeps itself going. So within the dialectics of prajna, the core thing to see is that our normal way of conceiving the world is oppositional. Our normal way of thinking, our normal way of formulating how it is that we experience things has to do with one thing not being another thing, and that's how we know what that particular thing is. So the framework here in terms of the dialectics is we'd say A is not B. Therefore, it is A. That sounds very logical, right? If I say, this glass of water is not my head, it's not this book, it's not my notes, it's not this, it's not Issei, it's not the pillow. And because it's not all of those things, it is a glass, all right? See how that thinking is oppositional, right? Now, I could define what the glass is, too. I could say it is this, and I could start explaining the qualities of the glass. I could say it's solid. I could say that it's clear. I could say that it's got these check marks on it, and I can see the line here where it was cast. It's filled with water. We've had this cup for a really long time. I don't know how many Dharma talks I've given with this cup, as being an example of something, but it's a lot. So there's all the qualities of the cup itself. But my mind, to try to understand the identity of the cup, right, is creating a fundamental fracture between the cup and everything else. That's very foundational to the way it is that we visually perceive something. If you couldn't pull this cup out from the background light, you couldn't even call it a cup. Okay, so if you think about that, all of the information that's going into your eyes right now, you can't even imagine the billions and billions of pulses of neurons that are going up into your visual cortex to create what you see right now. And your eyes are dancing around like this, and they're taking in all that information, and they're compiling what you think is a seamless world. Like, just look around the room. It doesn't fit in and out at all. Unless you've been meditating a lot, then sometimes it will do that. You just look around, it just seems like one seamless thing. The reason that your visual perception can do that is because it can pull out this object from all the other things and focus on it and say, oh, it's not that, it's not, oh, is, not, is, and then you build this cup. Okay, it's miraculous that we can experience the world through that process. But there's some weaknesses to that. Okay? In that process, we invest in the cup as being real. And what I mean by real here is it's an independently existing, outside of you thing. It is an object to your subject. Who here feels like a subject? I feel like a subject today. Yeah, of course we do. That's what it means to have agency. That's what it means to be alive. And so as a subject, I see the object of the cup, right? And it appears in relationship to my seeing, right? We think of it as independently real. Now, what happens in the dialectics of prajna, the seed that we're trying to plant here, is saying, let's shift that. Right? Let's see if there's another thing, there's another pattern, there's another way in which we could think about what's happening through conception or through perception. And the formula goes, A is not A, therefore it is A. Okay? If the first one, A is not B, therefore it is A. I can tell you all the things that the glass is not, and that helps me carve out the glass. Right? Within prajna, we say A is not A, therefore it is A, which sounds completely ludicrous, but let's look into it a little bit. Okay, if you say, on the surface, just my kind of my two-dimensional perception of this glass, right? Just thinking it's a thing that's out there, I'm trying to form something which is lasting and independent and real. But when I admit right from the beginning that, for there to be a glass here, there has to be everything else, right? Literally, for this glass to appear here, there's got to be everything else. What is that people are really fond of saying? Sometimes they say, well, we're all made of stardust, and horse manure, and a whole bunch of other things too, right? But all the things that go into our ability to experience this right now is completely unfathomable, right? We can start following it out and we could never find the end of it. So for there to be a glass here, there has to be, where did that glass come from? Where was it melted? Where did the heat that melted come from? Where did the mind that thought to make a glass this shape with this texture on it? What were all of its experiences, right? The water that's in it, where has that flown from? Flowed from. Where does it come from? It has flowed into this glass in one way or the other. Right? And so when we start to think in that way, we can say, for me to be able to see a glass is not the process of keeping away all of the non-glass things. Actually, to see a glass is to see the wholeness expressed as this glass. All of the things, including myself, that go into this glass being here. Now, the glass is not just an object of my subject. It's not just an object of my perception. It's not just a thing of the world. It's alive. It's alive because it's completely interdependent with all things. A tree is a nice thing to think of. Glass is nice. But if you think of a tree, maybe it's even easier. Has anyone been down by the Willamette River? There's that really, really old cherry tree. Maybe you go for a walk by the river. It's maybe down where the 4J offices are, down by the river. The Rose Garden. That's the place, by the Rose Garden. It's in the Rose Garden, actually. Amazing tree. Go sit by that tree. Sometimes I just go there and I just stop for a second and I look at it. I don't do anything particularly profound. I think my face probably looks pretty dumb. I'm just like, whoa. And any tree we could have that relationship with, but there's something about that ancient tree, all the things that humans have done to keep it going, right? And that deep interaction. And then if you stand by a tree for a little while and then you think about it, you feel into the earth, you realize, I'm only seeing a little bit of it. Some people say half. I think it's probably not really half. Right? Everything underground I don't see. There's also the tree. And then it's easy to follow it out from there. Where do those little roots end? And where does the earth begin? What other roots are they intertangled with? What is the whole sea of little bugs and microbes that are decomposing that keep that tree alive? And then if you follow it out to the branches, where there are these beautiful green leaves, this time of year, beautiful green leaves, and how you notice that the sun is shining on those leaves. And if you follow those rays of sun out, now you can start feeling the immensity of the tree. It's not just a tree that is separate from all the things around it. Let me cut it out, right? It is the wholeness of things appearing as this beautiful tree, as a beautiful person. When we start to see things this way, we recognize how ungraspable things are. So much you'll hear a kind of like a Buddhist teachings where they're saying, let go, let go, let go. That's good. I encourage you to do that. But it's kind of flat way to think about it. We don't just want to encourage ourselves to let go of things, to try to get rid of things that are precious to us. That's not what that teaching is about. It's about discover the ungraspability of something. When you encounter that tree or that glass or that person, you realize this and this don't work. They're just antithetical. That's the way that you deal with objects, right? But there's nothing here that's an object. Phenomena are not objects. They're us. We completely sharing a world. That aliveness, sometimes we also refer to as luminous. So we start there. We start there with thinking about what's the shift in my mind? How is it I shift the way that I'm thinking about things? And in that shift of the way I'm thinking about things, the way that I see things also change. And there's a kind of harmony that arises out of that. Now, one thing that I think is really important about this is not to see this, when I say the way that you think about things, it starts pointing to a discipline of the mind. And what I mean by mind here is a discipline of your thinking, grasping consciousness. How it is that you organize things in your head. Now that's true, okay? This kind of dialectics of prajna, kind of talking about A is not B, therefore it is A, or A is not A, therefore it is A. This all feels pretty heady. What I'm saying here is this is not just a discipline of the head, it's a discipline of the heart, it's a discipline of the body. And what I mean by discipline here, we could also maybe say practice. It has to do with the way that we bring ourselves forward in the world. So it doesn't just have to do with how we think, it has to do with how we feel. Feel in terms of our emotional feeling, but also feeling in terms of our physical embodied feeling. So that when you encounter something, if we're going to try to uncover this different way of encountering, a different way of unlocking something, then we have to get very sensitive to our own being. When you hear Hunter scream in the yard, what do? What happens in your? But that's the little boy. For those of you who don't know who Hunter was. And for people online, if you couldn't hear him, he was screaming in the yard just now. So what does that do? What does that call out in you? It's wide range depending on who you are. You might thought like, man, wouldn't it be cool if Hunter just went away? I don't have to hear him. It'd be easier to hear the talk. Maybe you thought that, or maybe part of you thought that. Maybe you thought, oh, is Hunter okay? Maybe you thought, ooh, wouldn't it be fun to play with Hunter? I have to sit here, listen to Ejo go on and on about stuff again. Hunter, we could get a slingshot, or we could slide down the slide, or we could play in the mud. There's all kinds of things. Anyway, your mind could go a whole bunch of different places. So what I'm saying here is, if we want to start taking the medicine of prajna, we have to deeply consider, we have to develop an awareness of our own being, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And that knowing, so sometimes people get this misunderstanding of prajna teachings. They think it's like, oh, just put it all aside, let go, get it all aside. It's empty anyway. And it's like a really flat cracker, those like really, what are those Swedish crackers? Those really flat ones? Yeah, and you definitely need something on it to eat it, right? If you eat it just like that, your mouth just goes like totally nothing. So we get like that in practice. People, when they hear the prajna's teachings, they think like, oh, get rid of it, right? And just getting very thin. And what I'm seeing here is just the opposite, that actually this is where the richness of life flows. Notice here, I'm not saying the grasping onto life to get what you want flows. I'm saying the deep richness of an ungraspable, luminous world appears as you become more aware of your own movements, all those subtle movements of your being. So, taking the medicine of wisdom, when we talked about meditation, I brought up this this teaching that meditation or dhyana is the ingestion of the wisdom medicine. There's a fundamental way that we can take this medicine is to sit upright. To let a stability of our body emerge, we have to investigate to do that. It's not just like put yourself in the right spot, just hold yourself still. We have to investigate, what is the stability of my body? Does that happen on a cushion? Does it happen on a bench? Does it happen on a chair? What's the best place for that deep stability to show its face? The same thing with my heart. Same thing with my mind. How do I harmonize the breath and the body? Not force the breath to be a certain way, but how do I allow the harmonizing of this body and this mind and this heart with the breath to emerge? Okay, I have to pay attention. I have to give space. I don't just think, oh, this is my breath. What am I going to do with it? Breath is an object, not luminous. It's only manipulation can follow from that. But what happens if I were to think about my breath as being, my breath is my breath because it's not my breath. My breath is made up of everything in the universe. That's why I breathe. My breath is not an object. Right? It's not even my breath. It is breath. How does it harmonize then with the body, which is not an object, with the heart that is not an object, with the mind that is not an object? This is what we're doing in meditation, is we're turning our mind that way. We're planting that seed that says there could be another way. And so, to start seeing the world in a different way, we have to cultivate. There's thinking about it. That, what's the process I go through of conceiving of the world in a very kind of mechanical way, but the organic whole of how it is that the world is conceived through us. To work with that is much more like cultivation. It's like planting your garden. It's like weeding, composting those weeds, getting them back in the soil, taking care of everything, right? Things that are very harmful that will destroy the garden, you need to put them to the side. Not because they're objects of your manipulation, but because you know what it will lead to. Right? So we cultivate attention, we cultivate awareness, we cultivate mindfulness. But I want to point out that all of those words, they can be taken in a very flat way. Like if we go back to the glass and we think that meditation is cultivating the ability to be able to hold your attention on the object of the glass, that's a mental exercise which you can get very good at. And it's good to get good at it. It's not bad, but it's pretty flat. How does it teach you about how to live? How does it teach you about the unfolding of life? How does it teach you about suffering? How does it teach you about the unlocking of suffering? Right? That takes something else. Okay. When we think about awareness is not just being able to hold an object in our mind. Awareness is being able to allow that thing to appear as the wholeness. There's no need to manipulate it at all. Now with a glass, that's one kind of exercise. But how about the thoughts and the feelings of your own being? How about the objects that you meet that have real significance to you? Rather than thinking about just cultivating awareness or mindfulness, I'd like you to think about how it is that your soul is invested in the phenomena that you encounter. Buddhism is slightly a bad word in Buddhism because people usually think of the word soul as being like independent spiritual thing that is in your body. Right? Isn't that the way we oftentimes think of soul? It's like this thing, it's like the real you, the spiritual you that's inside of the physical container or something like that. So within Buddhism, that kind of way of thinking of soul is not so not so helpful within the Buddhist teachings. But the reason I'm using soul here, I'm using it more like the entirety of your being, the wholeness that shows up as you. That's your agency, right? It's not just what you decide to do. It's the entirety of how it is that you encounter the world. How do you invest that in the way in which you are seeing things? That's the question of prajna. Not just like, can I hold my mind on this thing? But can I see the luminosity that's there? Can I see that the thing both is totally real and also not an object of my mind? But both of those things are real at the same time. Both of those are true at the same time. So this is the medicine of wisdom. Before I make some time for questions, I was going to go on to talk about something else this morning, but I've been trying to shorten my talks, and so the first thing I did was I made my paper smaller, and then that didn't work that well, but I kept doing it. So I'm making my paper smaller, and then I decided if I write down 5 things but only talk about 4, then maybe that will shorten them. So that's what I did today. But to give you a forecast here, this is all relatively easy when we're talking about a tree. If you start talking about a forest, you start talking about an ecosystem, you start talking about planet, and you talk about the health of all those things, this starts getting like a very rich discussion. If you start talking about a woman in the place of women in a patriarchal society or within a patriarchal tradition, you see how it's not so like, oh, beautiful tree, right? And that's why I read this story from the Vimalakirti Sutra last time, which I will pick up on next time. So I'm just mentioning that now because I realize this isn't just a simplistic, everyone loves trees. I think everyone loves trees. This is a nitty-gritty teaching that gets down into the places that are really difficult. Does anyone have any questions or comments? And people online, if you have a question, I think what we're doing now is you just start talking. Is that right, Stefan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you?
Yes.
Question from the Genjo koan. I've been reading it lately.
Mm-hmm.
The third line says, since the Buddha way by nature goes beyond the dichotomy of abundance and deficiency, there is a rising, perishing, delusion, etc.
Yeah.
It seems like he substitutes abundance and deficiency for maybe grasping and rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you could, I've been wondering why that is, or...
Yeah. I think I think your insight there is right on, that abundance and deficiency is one of the labels, it's one of the oppositions that we live in. So if we think about oppositional thinking, things like I have enough or I don't have enough. And those two things exist as a dichotomy, and we try to grab on to enough, and we try to keep away the not enough. So here, the thing I really like about those words is it feels to me like one of the places where Dogen is inviting in our emotional being, is inviting in our heart. What is my experience of enough or not enough? That's not an intellectual thing, right? It's a feeling thing. When I set those two apart from each other, and I only try to grasp after enough, then my life will be marked by not enough, and I'm always afraid of not having enough. So I have to learn to realize that, or to live in a way that enough is not separate from not enough. That when there's not enough, then we learn to face not enough directly. And in knowing not enough, we can also come to know enough. in a practical sense, if you think about the great disappointments in your life, or the holes that have appeared because there's something that you couldn't keep. There's a great grieving over those things. But they also teach us about how everything is alive. That the thing I had that was so precious to me, as I held it, because it's so precious, it almost inevitably becomes an object of my grasping because I'm holding it. I'm not saying just like some object. I'm talking about like people. If you're blessed to be a parent, which I know Sokai, you're on your way to that particular blessing. If you hold your children as precious, which you will, you very, very easily start to stifle them just by the way you see them, the way you conceive them. And when you lose them, in one way or the other, maybe for the first time you can see how alive they are and how alive the whole world is. And here I mean losing, in a literal sense, but I mean also just like them becoming teenagers. The little kid is little like the tree. It's like, oh, I love you. 13-year-old can be more challenging. Not always, but I taught middle school for a long time and high school for a long time. I'd say pretty good shot. There's going to be some challenge in that process. Yeah, and raised three daughters with my wife. Anyway, I feel like maybe I just wandered off someplace. Did that get to your question at all, Sokai?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Hi.
Today you talked a lot about perceiving or seeing wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
and what's confusing to me is moving with wisdom, or learning how to be in motion.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about that.
So thank you for bringing that up. That is what is so, to me, is what's so remarkable and powerful about the 6 Paramitas teachings, is that wisdom in action is known as generosity, as ethics, as patience, as vigor, and as meditation. So it's not enough for us to have a sense that we are cultivating the way it is that we see the world. That should be reflected in the way it is that we are doing things. So if you take generosity, for example, if you want to know what it's like to experience wisdom through movement, practice generosity. Don't try to make wisdom move, right? It's super easy. Just like take some stuff that someone else will benefit from and give it to them. That's not the only way to practice generosity. Mm-hmm. But if you are confused about what it would be, just do that. And in doing that, you will know right away what it is to open up that divide of subject and object, of agent and thing. When you take your strength, and it's not just like chucking something at another person or another being. It's like, how do I give you what I know of nourishment? Right? And as you give that, you'll see the way that you miss it. You don't do it exactly perfectly. You don't do it totally clean of ulterior motives. You don't do it totally out of total purity of heart. It doesn't matter. Do it with as much purity of heart and sincerity as you can bring to it. And give the gift. Let me share what I know of nourishment with you. And as you do that, it's just magic, really. And so that's what we turn to try to understand the wisdom in action, is those other 5. Now, that's a system. So it's helpful in the way that it gives you 5 categories you could think about, throwing yourself into, but really there's millions of ways, right? But each of those 5 are telling us something about the flavor of how an action can be liberating, not just a subject acting upon an object. So in meditation, rather than the subject of my aware consciousness inflicting itself on the object of thoughts that are arising, and so often we could think of meditation that way, right? But there's a movement in meditation, even though we're investigating stillness. Right? So what would happen if I was just giving the generosity of awareness, right? Which calls the bluff on there being a thinker and a thought. Like there's the thinker, which is kind of the pure overlord who's going to drive the thoughts out. If you give your awareness to the thoughts, you call the bluff, right? And something totally else can emerge there. So in that way, dhyana or meditation is also activity. It's an activity of ingesting the wisdom medicine, but the wisdom medicine is also what allows meditation to take place. And that's true in each of those different paramitas. Okay, we probably have time for one more if anyone has any.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Where does this is just so random?
Yeah.
Coming from.
We have one question happening right now in the hall. Maybe people can't hear it. If I do that, will they be more able to hear?
You want to take that question?
No, please. You were started. Yeah.
Where does gratitude and humor fit into all this?
Gratitude and humor?
Yeah.
Oh, I think just very directly. I don't think you need to fit it in. It's just like, to me, so humor, if we go back to giving a gift, for example, try this next time you give a gift. It's hilarious. When you take something that you're kind of doing this with, and just as it crosses the line, it's like, oh my God, what was I thinking? What was that place? I mean, it could also be a place, other emotions could come there too. But I think for me, that's always there's a humor, there's a hilariousness to it. The other side I think about humor that oftentimes when we think about humor is we're thinking about the compassion. Humor can be a lot about compassion, about accepting how things are rather than holding the kind of stiffness about where they should be. That's what makes comedians so hilarious, is they can bring that out. And so I think that's also about the generosity I was talking about within dhyana, within meditation. When you allow your thoughts to be, rather than being the overlord of the controlling them, a lot of funny stuff goes on in there, and that's about acceptance, and I would say likewise for gratitude, because things that are objects, they can't really nourish us. Just think about that for a second. Things that are objects can't really nourish because they exist on the other side of a divide. They exist out there. For you to be able to ingest them, you have to give up on that. Now you could eat them, right? But we all know how eating can be the opposite of nourishment, right? It can be nourishing in a certain way. We get calories. But does it actually support the wholeness of our life is another question. So this is where I think gratitude lies, is that place where the release of that duality fills us with a sense of wholeness. And for that, then, for me, it's my head bowing. That's how I experience it. Maybe it's gasho, or maybe it's a thank you card. Everyone has their own way. Okay, there was one more started, so we'll do that and then we'll end, I promise. Was it Reiko? Were you starting to ask a question?
Hi, yes.
Yes.
A question about so I think I get conflicted with the teaching on not picking and choosing.
Mm-hmm.
And when we are taking over, how deciding to lead is not pushing away or denying from God. So how can you have the agency to cultivate it? It maybe seems arrogant to cultivate and to deny to lead space with now. How can I hold it?
So I couldn't the connection's a little funny, so I couldn't hear everything you were saying, but I think I got the gist of it. In terms of the picking and choosing, at what point can you actually pick or choose something? Is that just the arrogance of me inflicting my own subject upon the world, or is there a place in which we can take action there? This is to me is the question about harmonizing. Okay, so of course we have to act. Right? Things are moving around in the world, and we make a decision to do this or to do that. Right? From an oppositional way of thinking, it's always a project of how do I keep the bad away and how do I keep the good close. However it is that I define good and bad. So in this discipline of prajna, when we start to investigate how good and bad arise together, we start to investigate that when we meet something, we're not meeting just an object of our mind, but we're meeting something with an expression of the wholeness that is showing up as that thing. Then we move to take care of life. We can feel how it changes. So if we go back to the garden metaphor, for example, if we're looking at the garden, and have you ever been in someone's garden? I know this one guy who likes to grow tomatoes, and it's like, I don't know how many herbicides and pesticides he uses to keep his tomatoes going, but it's a lot. It's like his tomato garden is like a barren wasteland, except for the tomato plants with these big red tomatoes on it. So that's one way we could garden. And we know about all the external, even if the tomatoes end up tasting good, which to me is a question whether they can or not. But even if they could, what are all the external costs that are associated with that grasping after that perfect red tomato without complication? Right? And where's the place where you can grow very delicious tomatoes, and you pull out the not tomato elements and you put them back into the soil. Or if it's running grass, you send it to Lane Forest Products to let them put it back in the soil because it will, take over your garden, right? So this is it's like very reasonable actually, very balanced, very simple. But it's about appreciating the wholeness of what's happening there rather than just trying to manipulate what's going on. Now, having said that, there are times where we need very strong medicine for some problem, And so when is the right time to apply that very strong medicine? Is there a time to apply an herbicide or an insecticide? Ever? Probably. There probably is some time you could imagine. But when is that? If you don't stay connected to the wholeness of the situation, you can never make that deliberation through the wholeness. You only make it through your kind of immediate desire for the shiny red tomato. So that's what I mean by harmonizing, is that as we change our perception in this way, now we have other choices available to us that we don't have when we're just grasping after this perfect ideal. And this then carries over into how do we deal with real imbalances and inequities within our human society. We can't just brush things aside. We have to see how important each individual thing, the identity of any given being, is about the wholeness of being. How do we start acting that way? That takes a kind of fierceness, right? Which is not about sweeping aside distinctions. It's about showing up as who we are in a really radical way. That's what I'm going to talk about next week.